Growing up, I always said that I wanted to move to France, but I don't know that I ever really knew what that meant. I definitely didn't know what that meant growing up, but I think I have an idea now. Because of the ambiguity of this desire to move to France, but not really knowing why, I always kind of felt like the odd man out. I studied French in high school. I insisted on studying French. I refused to study Spanish. I wish I would have studied Spanish, but I just had it in my head. I wanted to learn French because I wanted to live in France. And that's about as far as it went. But the reason it made me feel like the odd man out was that everybody else that I knew that was studying French was doing so for reasons, like their favorite food or favorite song, literature. There were a lot of reasons why people were obsessed with French culture, but I just had this idea that I needed to go to France. I would later credit this desire when asked with reading Tintin when I was a kid. I did love the Tintin books as a kid, and I'm sure that they affected my desire for some adventure and travel, but Tintin doesn't go to France, and he's Belgian. I'm sure there's an episode where he ends up in Paris at some point, but that's not remotely the point of those books. And I still don't know where that desire for France specifically came from. Honestly, this weird sense of being an outsider, despite having a really strong desire to go to France, would persist for so much of my life. I mean, it still kind of lingers a little bit today because in college especially, people had real connections to France or real desires to go there for whatever reason. Cooper's obsessed with peeing on discarded Christmas trees, so he's very Parisian. We know what gets Cooper going every day. But that desire to move to France ended up sending me to Nice, if you're familiar with my story, because I had some connection there. It was France, and it's where I could go to work on my French, but it didn't really scratch the itch I had, and I pretty quickly started wondering, did I make a mistake? Not having that feeling of connection, whether that was because I really loved Edith Piaf or I imagined myself being the next Ernest Hemingway or whatever it was that seemed to connect people to Paris that I didn't have, often left me feeling really insecure, and actually often also made me feel a little bit invalidated in my desire for a country that I'd never even seen. I'd never even left my own country. I'd never left America until I was my junior year of college, with the exception of going to British Columbia once when I was 8 years old, I think. And all I really remember from that was really, really good cream on my waffles. Just as a side note, but I recognize that this is actually where I've got a little bit of a chip on my shoulder for Americans coming to Paris sometimes, because often what will happen is they will get really excited when they find out that I live here or that I have a love of the city, and they'll be like, oh, well, what about this? And they'll insert, a niche interest, or an interest that maybe isn't so niche, but I don't necessarily share or know that much about. And then immediately they go oh, well then why are you even there if you don't like X? As if X was the only reason to living in Paris, not the social media, fill in the blank, you know what I mean? And that always really bothered me because it did feel kind of invalidating, especially because I didn't really know why I loved the city as much as I do. Having people question it because I didn't like it for the same reason they did really bothered me, and it happened a lot when I first moved here. Thankfully, it doesn't happen so much anymore. But in reality, I was running, which is something that didn't fully crystallize for me until years later, 7 years later, when I wound up in the Congo. And I looked around at a lot of the people that were volunteering on this hospital ship in West Africa. That's a whole nother story. But I recognized so many of them were running from something, whether that was emotional or physical. I knew a guy that was actually in the witness protection program who was waiting for basically a mob trial to be resolved. And so he was just working on the ship as far from danger as he possibly could while he waited for that to go down. But not everyone has as obvious a reason to be running as the mafia. And it took me a while to figure out that I even was running, let alone what I was running from. Thing is, I shared recently for the first time in depth my relationship with my mom, or lack thereof, I suppose. And the reality that I was neglected as a kid, which makes it really hard to know when you're running from something, when you've spent your entire life thinking that you're running towards something, turning towards your mother, your primary caregiver, and looking for emotional support, looking for love, looking for things that you're just never going to get in the way that you need. Certainly you're never going to feel. And so what's funny is that I didn't realize that what I really was trying to do was run away, to find some space, to build space, because I couldn't admit to myself that that's what I really needed. So in the name of adventure, in the name of going and finding something else elsewhere, I guess maybe that was an acceptable way of building space, without having to actually say that's what I was trying to do. And not even to anybody else, admitting that to myself. actually really lucky because I did ultimately discover a city that I love very much. Like, to finish that part of the story, at the end of my time in Nice, when I was like, was this a mistake? Should I not have done this? I came back through Paris for a week on my way out of the country and immediately fell in love. Like, as soon as I hit the ground here. It wasn't my first time technically in Paris. I did pass through Paris on my way to Nice, but I was jet lagged, exhausted, and just wanted to get out of the city as fast as I could because it was overwhelming when I first hit it. But in coming back, I mean, it is not an exaggeration to say that I fell head over heels in love with this city. The dynamism, the vibe, the beauty of it, the food, the people, so many things, right, that drew me in. And it wasn't really France I'd been looking for. It was a place to go, to explore, to be anonymous, to be surrounded by diversity and change, to be able to challenge a lot of deep-seated beliefs that I wasn't able to fully challenge where I came from. Because it's actually not even entirely just about the struggles that I had with my family growing up and the neglect and everything that goes along with that. Turns out that a lot of the ways that I was raised with religion, and to use a very strong word, a lot of bigoted mentality, were things that I internally really struggled with and really rejected, but had a really hard time consolidating. I struggled with a lot of cognitive dissonance for a really, really long time, believing in compassion, looking out for the best interest of other people, looking out for the downtrodden, the marginalized, the outsider. That was definitely a huge part of who I was. Part of that came from my own insecurities, part of that came from my own lack of self-esteem, for sure. But at the same time, like, I really did buy into the whole love element of what I was taught growing up. I've made a whole long video about this as well, but what I saw so much of in the church and in that community was the opposite of that, was absolutely not inclusive, was absolutely not loving, was very, very hateful at its root. And obviously we've seen that play out in even more dramatic ways in recent times, but honestly, that's just so much of the history of America. There's a lot of sirens today. I wrote this down in my journal this morning when I was thinking about how I wanted to approach this video. I think a lot of times we buy into the myth that we can overcome anything if we just tackle it head on. Like, I'm strong enough, tough enough, smart enough, I can just take this. But sometimes what we actually need is space. What we need is distance from those challenges to heal, to figure ourselves out, and then to come back at them stronger than we ever could have if we'd stayed in the fight the whole time. And especially because I grew up in a cultural and religious tradition that told me that, like, I needed to be independent, self-reliant, strong, and also somehow save the world, whether that was for Jesus or for capitalism, or a marriage of both, because apparently they go hand in hand. It was on me to, like, actually just get down and do it and suffer in silence and just power through. And I don't really believe that. I did believe it. I don't believe it anymore. I think sometimes we need to stop, take care of ourselves, and sometimes that means remove ourselves as far from all of those challenges as we can, to then realize whatever our internal actual strength is, and then figure out how to re-engage from there. And I didn't know it at the time, but ultimately, I think that's the real reason that I came to France. And thanks to today's patron producer, Jane Boyce, and all my patrons for making this possible. My patrons not only made it possible for me to restart my life in 2018 when I declared bankruptcy and started my life over here in France. It's not just about the financial support, which is really important, but it's also that they really believed in what I was doing enough to put their money down. They made a declaration, and they were supportive in a way that I never felt growing up and into college and on. So it really means a lot to me. Thank you. If you're one of my patrons, if you've ever been one of my patrons, even for a brief period of time, thank you so much, because it not only enables me to do this, to do the work, get through therapy, to work on myself, to have built a life, to share what I'm exploring, everything that you see here, but it's actually also been a part of the healing process and believing that I'm worth $5 a month or whatever it is, and what I'm doing matters. So thank you to my patrons, and I'm gonna get out of traffic now because this intersection has been insane and it's taken me 10 minutes just to record that.